Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We're listening to Justice for Haley.
Wilder crimes. These are the stories of the elite team that solves them in the most dangerous crime scenes in the world. Our national parks.
He's a danger. This man has killed supposedly 2 lives.
And he believes he's not going to be arrested.
She started moving the money he was living on. The gig was up.
Everybody's going to find out that he's a fraud.
I was in a state of shock that somebody could be so evil. The last thing that Tony ever had going through her mind was him pushing her off.
This is a murder motivated by money and malice.
Can you prove the difference between a push and a fall?
A woman was killed, and it took a toll on me. Just the stress level was really high. And I did bring it home. My husband got tired of hearing about it, and I would wake up in the middle of the night obsessing about it. What do I need to do next? What's the next thing? Since 1992, Harold has not been employed. He has not had an income. We're still trying to build a snapshot of Harold's lack of income for 18 years leading up to Tony Henthorne's death and $4.7 million in insurance.
But to prove it in court's going to be difficult.
That's a lot of reasons to kill someone. All through this is in the back of my mind that I don't want to lose this case because of something that I miss. That's always there. That's always hanging. That's why it took us a long time to actually arrest him.
To build a solid case, it's like making a solid table. You can't build a table with one leg or two legs. You have to have four legs. This one he calls the Stanley on his way up. So there's a lot of witnesses that need re-interviewed. There's more data that comes in that we want to make sure we're filling up all the holes in our case.
I think it's relevant because he's not telling the truth, right? It's back to that same thing of we're not trying to prove he didn't have a job.
And at the same time, we're very concerned about Haley's safety.
Our daughters went to school together since they were about 2 years old. I remember going to their house for Haley's birthday. Scripted, it seemed. It just seemed a little exaggerated.
He had control over everything that Haley ate or drank. Haley still has a baby monitor in her room. He wanted total control, and there's no one you can control more than your child.
In my opinion, the reason that he wanted to form the bonds that he had with Haley was for her to be raised in his exact likeness.
See you later, alligator.
We knew that if we didn't support Harold while this investigation's going on, then we would be cut off from Haley.
The Burleys, they would go on vacation with Harold or go visit Harold, and then they would call me in. They were providing our investigation with as much information as they could.
This is my brother, the spouses, my parents, very, very close friends. We're all playing this game.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know how they lasted as long as they did.
Everybody involved is in their own ways hopeful on one day and despondent on the next because it's taking a lot of time. And in that time, Harold's attitude changes really dramatically.
We started noticing a change in Harold. He started calling overconfident, cocky, they can't do anything to me. Just really bizarre kind of talk.
Harold is back to his old, ultra-confident self again. He believes he's back in control. He's not going to be arrested.
It was very difficult on my parents knowing that this man has killed their daughter. We had run the course of our value to the investigation, and after a visit to Denver, it became very clear that Harold was using our family as a tool to say, hey, look, they are supporting me, therefore I'm innocent. And we said, enough. So with that, it's time to finally go out in public.
We did not want Toni cremated. And Harold insisted. We wanted to bring her home and bury her.
I think he was trying to hide evidence. I think that Harold Henthorne pushed my sister off the mountain.
Harold Henthorne immediately cut off all communication and all contact with Haley. If we sent gifts out to Haley for her birthday, she never received them. He wanted Haley to believe that we didn't care about her.
I can only imagine what the Bertolets were going through. It was a long time coming, but there was a point where we said we have enough to get a arrest warrant finally in hand for Harold.
We had our surveillance team watching him for a couple days because we did not want to arrest Harold with his young daughter there and create some sort of hostage situation.
A lot's going on, a lot of moving parts, all merging towards this moment where we're going to hopefully arrest Harold Henthorne. So Harold knew that we were investigating him, and he had told people that he had a bag packed for when he got arrested.
We knew that arrest was coming, we just didn't know when. But it occurred on my parents' wedding anniversary, and so they got a nice little wedding anniversary having Harold Henthorne arrested.
We transported him to the United States Marshals.
She's in the back seat of my car with another FBI agent. That's in that passenger seat. And you have to fill out a questionnaire as you're going to the U.S. Marshal's office. What's your name? What's your date of birth? What's your occupation? So when it came to what's your occupation, Harold paused. Harold knew that we knew he didn't have a job. And I said, Mr. Henthorne, you don't have to answer. And he said, okay, I choose not to answer that question. Here we get there to the marshal's office, and an attractive young female marshal is booking him in, and she goes through the exact same questions: name, date of birth, occupation. And for occupation, he goes, I'm a fundraiser for hospitals and churches. He just told her the whole story right in front of us.
Even under arrest with handcuffs on, he can't help but lie about who he is.
It was surreal for Beth and I to watch that happen.
Even when things didn't go his way, he would create a reality to support what he wanted, and would relentlessly just ensure that was the reality portrayed to people.
A fear of ours was that Harold Henthorne would flee the country and nobody would have access to Haley.
We thought, really, he's a danger. This man has killed supposedly 2 wives, and the last thing he wanted was him going home to his child.
We needed to indict him pretty quickly.
We charged him with first-degree murder.
We did ask for no bail. Our forensic accountant, who is fabulous, was able to determine that Harold was starting to move money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that elevated our concern.
He's a flight risk and poses a risk to the community. Those are the reasons a federal judge has given for denying bond to Harold Henthorne.
he had to spend all his time in jail prior to his trial.
Harold had a couple friends that, if anything happened to him or Tony, were legal guardians to Haley.
I think she was with us for about 14 months. We certainly felt that Haley more rightfully deserved to be with the Bertolays and back with her natural family rather than with us. It was obvious that with all the control that Harold had, she hadn't had the ability to mature like kids her age had. She had it tough.
We saw a lot of similarities between Lynn Henthorne's death and Tony's murder.
After Harold's arrest, the Rochelle's and Bertolays began to share information.
And we started talking with the Rochelle's and we started comparing notes. Both his wives died directly in front of him, yet he doesn't see anything. It occurred around anniversaries. Both of them were supposed to be going to dinner reservations. You could just go on down the line and they were exactly the same.
One of the good things that came out of this was that I started communicating with Grace again and supporting her as she develops this list between what happened with Lynn and what happened with Tony that we gave to the detectives.
Once Harold gets arrested, the clock starts ticking on trial.
We have a certain amount of time in which to bring him to trial.
We need to prove that he was very key to Lynn's death. So we had to strategize on what circumstantial evidence would be key to our investigation.
Circumstantial evidence is not what we think it is. It doesn't mean evidence that should be discounted by a jury. It just means evidence that doesn't point directly to someone's involvement in the crime.
You go to bed at night and there's no snow on the ground, and you wake up the next morning and there's snow on the ground. You have not seen it, so there's no direct evidence. It is circumstantial. You see footprints in the snow. How do you know that somebody walked across that snow? You don't have the direct evidence that somebody walked across your yard, but you have circumstantial evidence because the footprints are left behind. So our job is to find the footprints that are left behind and who put them there.
Building the case against Harold was a monumental effort. We didn't always agree on that. Like, we would fight as a team about, no, we got to do this, or how do we do that? How do you take, like, just tons of evidence and distill it down to what matters?
A lot was up in the air. My superiors were wondering if we should strike some sort of deal with Harold ahead of time, just because everybody's primary concern was Haley.
Harold hires an attorney named Craig Sherman.
He's a very well-respected criminal defense attorney in town who has decades of experience.
I think Harold's lawyer strategy is to figure out what our case is and where he can poke holes in it.
Potentially 2 women died because of this man. We are the voice of Tony when it comes to the trial. We have to tell her story, her side of it.
Always in the back of our mind was, how are we going to do this?
There are a lot of variables, so this is going to be very critical.
So as we did investigation, Harold turns out to be a not very nice person. But that doesn't make you a killer. You know, you could be a jerk. That doesn't mean you murdered your wife.
Tony was set to inherit a lot of money. She was set for life. She knew it, they knew it, and certainly Harold knew it. If Harold and Tony had had a great marriage, then Tony is worth far more alive than she ever would be dead.
In December of 2011, we made our last trip to Colorado to see the Henthornes. So Tony, she looked exhausted. More than just exhausted, she looked worn out. And she looked like she was ready to come home. I just saw something in her eyes that this is not what I signed up for. I know for sure that finances drove Harold's decision making. He was obsessed with finances. There was rarely a conversation when the subject of money didn't come up.
So I asked Dana Chamberlain, who was a financial analyst in my office, if she would start digging into the financial records, which meant getting bank records. She went through and demonstrated that all the income that came in was Tony's, but that Henthorne controlled every account, the signatory and the bank accounts, and where all the mail went. It all went to him, so that even though Tony made the money, she had no idea what was happening with it.
Money didn't impress Tony. It wasn't important to her. She let him take care of everything.
Tony Henthorne got regular royalty checks from her family because they're in the oil industry.
These checks that Tony would get for oil and gas, Harold would deposit them. And at one point, Tony's father found out that all of the oil and gas checks went into Harold's account. And he confronted Tony with it. He said, why don't you have your own account? Why don't you separate your finances from Harold? And that spurred Tony to open up her own bank account. And she actually took the next checks and she deposited them. Harold was not on that account.
She got another phone, and so she gave another one of my friends a different number because I think Harold controlled her phone.
I thought to myself, she's about to leave him.
If Tony keeps going in the trajectory that she's going on, there's probably going to be a divorce.
And I don't think that Harold would have allowed that to happen.
Divorce really wasn't an option for Harold Henthorne. Everybody's going to find out that he has no career, that he has no income, that he's a fraud.
Harold took care of the money down to the penny, so the loss of an oil and gas royalty check was significant enough that he realized this is going to be a problem. Tony was taking steps to be independent. If she started moving the money he was living on, the gig was up.
The motive started solidifying pretty quickly.
Beth Schott and Johnny Grusing were insistent then on finding out where Harold was traveling to, because they hired a nanny so that he could travel every Thursday and Friday. We know he's not flying out of state. We can't find any hotels. There weren't any cash withdrawals coming out, so we couldn't figure out what he was doing.
So, Johnny, what do you know about Harold's movements? I had a big pile of cell tower information as well as call information, and I gave that pile to Johnny. I said, try to figure out where Harold was going on these business trips.
So when you're using your cell phone, it is pinging off the local tower, so we can find where your phone has been on given dates and times.
It probably took me a week or two to plot all his goings, and I see this as a pattern through the first couple of Thursdays that he's over in Southwest Littleton, which is about 10 miles from his house. And I'm wondering, what's he doing over there? And why was he having to hire a babysitter to get there? You know, he's going through a lot of effort to go to Southwest Littleton. The two cell towers kind of look like little pies, and they intersected at this mall we call Aspen Grove Mall. And there's probably 30 stores there. I called Beth and said, can you meet me down here at Southwest Plaza? She's there probably within half an hour, so we hit up to Panera. And I had a picture of Harold to show to the manager. And she said, oh yeah, I know him. He was in all the time. And he would spend probably 3, sometimes 4 hours back there, either on his cell phone or on a computer just surfing the internet. Both Beth and I were thrilled. And for me, it also validated the cell phone technology, and that I'm looking at these two towers. I know he's somewhere in the middle, and boom, he's right there.
Along with the Panera hits on the cell tower, Johnny also started seeing a pattern of movement up to Estes Park.
So I first saw on August 16th, I saw him hit an Estes Park tower. It's the first time that I could see him hit the tower in Estes Park where he was actually reaching out to 911, saying, my bride is gone, all that sort of stuff.
911, what's your emergency?
My wife has fallen full of
south and coming north to the summit of your mountain.
And then I saw gaps in communication, and Harold was always on his cell phone. And so to see a gap of 8 hours, I'm like, what's he doing? And so I started looking more then for gaps instead of who he's calling, of when is he not calling or texting. And I found 6 of those gaps. And each of those, it's almost like breadcrumbs where you could see him go from his house up north of town, then his cell phone goes off. And then you wait about 6 or 8 hours, and then you can see the breadcrumbs coming back down to his house. Each time it points towards Estes Park. On August 16th and August 24th, he does the same thing. So he keeps on doing this. I think his most significant trip was on September 9th. And he goes up north, the cell phone's off. He comes back down, but it's the next morning when he calls Cherry Creek Eye Surgeons and says, hey, I need you to block off September 28th. I'm going to take her for this hike up in Estes Park. So I believe on September 9th, he finds a spot.
And what Johnny figured out is Harold leaving his home in Highlands Ranch and driving up into Rocky Mountain National Park 8 or 9 times every weekend leading up to Tony's death. And it started once Harold figured out Tony had opened up her own bank account.
11 days after her death, he drives up to a First Bank with an obviously forged signature of Tony for the exact amount that cleaned out that account she opened on her own.
We felt that we had enough to present as evidence. We all said, are we ready? Did we have enough to prove it to the jury?
We knew we had one last major hurdle. One of the things that we did legally was to make a decision that we were going to try and use the 1995 death of Lynn Henthorne in the case. And in our case, it was to show that this was not an accident, and to show the intent and planning that Harold had.
Harold's the only witness. Harold's not injured in any way.
So to tie Lynn's death to Tony's death, we needed to show that they were similar in a variety of ways. Harold had a lot to gain financially because of the insurance money. One is under a car in the middle of the night. Tony was under a deck in the middle of the night when the beam fell on her head. And then Tony was on the edge of a dangerous cliff. The more similarities we can show a judge, the better chance that Valeria and Sunita could bring these into the courtroom.
This was everything. There was nothing more important than this.
Judge Jackson asked both sides to brief it, which means submit legal pleadings that lay out why it should be admissible.
We had a several-day hearing on it. We knew it was absolutely key and important. So did the defense and so did the judge. So we really hammered it.
We went to the pretrial very concerned that the evidence was not going to be allowed in.
This was going to be a very difficult case to prove. So this was crucial to see what we could get in there ahead of time so that we could have a much better chance when the trial came in September.
Valeria and I put on the various witnesses during the evidentiary hearing.
It's difficult to take on a cold case because so many years have gone by. But people who witness a traumatic event really do retain very clear, take them back to the moment kind of memories. It turned out to be almost a mini trial within the trial. We were not proving that Lynn was murdered. They could only use it for the limited purpose to show that it was not likely that Tony's death was an accident based on the similarities of Lynn's death.
Harold's lawyer strategy was to keep Lynn Henthorne's death out of evidence. He definitely was pushing hard and arguing hard that shouldn't come in.
The judge called us to the bench and said, "Are you sure that you want to get into this? Do you really want to use this? Because if you're gambling now and you are, and you're wrong, you retry this case." Everyone knew how important it was. Janine and I looked at each other and said, yes, we're going to use all the cards on the table. We're not going to leave anything.
We did not want to lose this trial. When you're playing with, a young girl's life, I'd rather be safe than sorry.
New information today about what will be allowed in court during the Harold Henthorne trial. Well, a judge ruling today that jurors will be allowed to learn that his first wife also died under mysterious circumstances.
The judge agreed that yes, Lynn's death and the Beam incident, the similarities are too strong to be ignored.
The judge has said, yes, we are going to allow that into the trial. So I was elated, very, very grateful.
And it really was an incredible feeling of relief, as well as knowing what our marching orders were.
This morning, the trial begins for a Highlands Ranch man accused of killing his wife. The federal judge in the case told prospective jurors this trial, quote, will be a doozy.
And we are tracking breaking news just into our newsroom. Harold Henthorne happening today, disturbing new details.
New information in the
It's very rare that we do a case that has that strong media attention. And there were cameras outside the courthouse every day.
You just don't get a case like this but once in a lifetime.
There was a cover story in People magazine, and I'm actually mentioned in the story. So I've never had a case like this.
prosecutors feel this is a murder motivated by money and malice.
Yeah, this is it. There's no go backs.
A sinister plot by a husband determined to control his wife and her fortune.
It's a lot tougher than you think to get a jury to agree. I don't know how 12 people agree on a pizza topping, let alone on the guilt or innocence of somebody.
Expect opening statements today in the trial against a Highlands Ranch man accused of pushing his wife off of a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park.
When they brought Harold Henthorne in, he was in shackles and he looked like he had aged quite a bit.
This is opening day of the trial. It's laying out the foundation of the case, but also giving that first impression.
We knew we needed to start strong. He intended to kill her. The fall broke her neck. We started emotionally, let out so much scepter. $4.5 million. So you're trying to build the story of what happened that night, but you also want to start introducing evidence. So Harold's lawyer, he recognized that you couldn't explain away all of Henthorne's quirks. He sort of embraced him and said, sure, he might be quirky, but that doesn't make him a murderer. And to really, challenge us because it was a circumstantial case.
We're hearing things that we didn't know, such as, how in the world did Harold Henthorne get $4.5 million of life insurance policies on my sister?
We showed the autopsy photos of Tony because he never mentions that she's got a massive head wound and that she's bleeding out profusely. And so we wanted to ensure that the jury understood that there's no way he could mistake the injuries.
We were staying in a hotel and we were on the 15th floor. And I looked down and I said, wow, that's the amount of distance my sister fell. What a terrible way to die.
That was very hard. It was very hard on Miss Bertolet. It broke my heart to see her.
Because Lynn's death had never been litigated, there had never been any justice for the family, it was really important to them to see somebody doing something about it.
Truman's strategy in general was to try to make Lynn's death seem very innocent. Law enforcement closed the case within a week, so this is a big nothing.
We presented so much of who Lynn was and what happened to her that she almost had her day in court.
So we put on pictures taken at the original scene of the jack and the changing of the tire.
But we didn't know that other people had stopped by and pulled her out, that he was very agitated at the accident scene with people. He didn't want them to touch her.
I was angry, but I was more almost in a state of shock and disbelief that somebody could be so evil and have penetrated our family.
God bless Barry Bertolate. I remember talking with him once and just saying how sorry I was. And he very graciously just said, Harold fooled us all.
Harold, he's smiling at his friends, and he enough of a narcissist, it's all about him. Beth was our case agent, and so we were going to be putting her on the stand. She was a key witness.
I was very nervous. It's incredibly nerve-wracking to testify, especially in a homicide. One of the challenges of doing a case like this is, did I miss something? Something that will cause the jury to say not guilty.
Beth was outstanding. Like a race of a marathon, this was finally her finish line.
I talked about the forensic stuff. The timestamp on the camera helped build our timeline. And then also the scene, because I had been there several times.
Beth being able to guide us up and down there multiple times was fascinating to the jury.
Because we couldn't bring the jury to the scene, we instead brought the scene to them.
What I think had a big impact on the jurors was having about 2 or 3 rangers, park rangers, talk them through how difficult it was to get up there and then how dangerous it was to be there. And their testimony was able to almost take the jurors up there to that site.
We would play the exhibit of that scene. We're looking at the jurors' faces, and they have the aha moment.
Harold did not get up and speak at all in the trial.
Craig Truman didn't bring in any witnesses. He just cross-examined.
The prosecution gets 2 closes. I did the first close, and Valeria did what's called a rebuttal.
The defense spent a lot of time on pushing back on Lynn's case.
This case has been investigated, and it has been determined that this death was an accident. No criminal charge.
And then he kept saying, no need to look at this again. It was an accident.
That's the evidence.
This poor man has lost 2 wives. How heartbreaking could that be?
Truman really hammered home that you can't tell the difference between a fall from a push.
Evidence. What has been removed? No way on God's earth to tell whether someone was pushing or hesitating.
He did a good job. He also has a different job, right? We have to convince 12 people, and he just has to have one get some doubt.
I remember sitting there thinking, I'm so proud of the prosecution. These women took control.
On the 7th floor today was I was trying to imagine how Tony walked.
Last we've been touched. Tony Anthorn never felt.
The defendant tells us there's no way to tell.
It was not a loving caress from her husband, but a push that described deeply in her mind.
It was a lie the whole way through.
Valeria, she brought you almost to the top of that cliff.
Fell over 128 feet to her death.
I will never forget Sunita saying, this is the man that is supposed to guard and protect his wife. And the last thing that Tony ever had going through her mind was him pushing her off.
So after closing arguments, the case goes to the jury.
You sit down and you think, I hope we get it. It's a lot tougher than you think to get a jury to agree.
I felt like we made the case, but there's still a lot of anticipation, a lot of, oh my gosh, I don't know.
You're always nervous about what 12 people are thinking, and they have to unanimously decide that we have met our burden. I remember Sunita and I looking at each other going, it's going to be guilty, right? It's going to be guilty. And I was like, I don't know. You just don't know.
The judge reads the verdict. In the matter of the United States versus Harold Henthorn, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. There was like audible whoops of joy that came out of the courtroom.
I was just so happy.
We were all very thankful, very relieved.
Just elation. I don't think anybody understands how nervous you are and how stressful it is going through that trial.
We all look at each other, and it's an overwhelming emotion that hits you, and you look back at the Bertolets, and they're crying. And all of this is to get justice for Tony, justice for Haley, justice for the Bertolets, and we did it. It's a really, really satisfying moment.
When they did convict him, I was able to say, goodbye, Harold. They were locking him out.
The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Harold appealed to the 10th Circuit, specifically the Lynn Henthorn piece, and he lost. He appealed that to the United States Supreme Court, and they denied it. And so his appeal on the trial is over.
There was a time when I wanted to get out more information on Lynn, but at the end of the day, Lynn received justice.
If it had not been for Lynn's case, he very well would have walked. It wouldn't have been enough, even the circumstantial.
Lynn was a lover. My sister was a giver. And he took advantage of that. The world lost a lover. We need more of that in this world.
Here's to celebrating life, since we all have it. Family.
We're healing, and this was part of it.
If Toni was here, I would tell her how much I loved her and how much I missed her.
Okay, Daddy, being the elder statesman in the group, you want to say some closing words?
I wish everybody had a life as nice as mine. That's enough.
These type of interviews are therapeutic for us, and it's good for other people to know the experiences that we had, to recognize those red flags that we saw but we didn't act on.
I believe that putting Harold in a position where he cannot control anything is great punishment for Harold. I do think the punishment fits the crime. He robbed Haley of a mother.
He is cold.
Through everything that we've gone through, that's one of the biggest rewards that we have received. My brother and sister-in-law adopted Haley. She is just a thriving, dynamic young lady now, brilliant, and allowed to do all the things that she wasn't allowed to do early on in her life.
This crime happened on national park land, and it's sort of sacred to citizens of this country. It's where we get to go and see nature unspoiled, just see the wildlife. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of the most visited national parks in the country, and I know that the park rangers who work there are really proud of that.
Working for the National Park Service, you get paid in sunrises and sunsets and awesome beauty. We care about all the resources, but utmost we care about is human life.
There's an honor to the federal land. Thinking you can get by because it's so remote? Think again. Think again.
Secrets in the wild, brutal murders, beautiful yet treacherous places. These are the stories of the investigators who solve crimes in the wilderness.
I was really hoping this wasn't human remains.
Who is this person? This was not just some isolated individual that not another soul on this planet cared about.
Was it a murder? Was it a suicide?
You always assume foul play. There really did seem to be a rise in these serial killers.
A woman alone ain't safe at all.
They have a person down here who's confessing to killing people in national parks.
Is he telling the truth?
Is it possible another suspect killed her? Absolutely.
It was a true mystery.
And I was like, oh my gosh, you got a name.
Who would have thought that her son would come back in the same position that she was in and solve the case?
I don't think there's much of history I haven't seen in my life I've never piped into. That's how I grew up, and that's how I wanted my kids to grow up. We've always made a full day trip to Yosemite. We would take off and have a picnic down in the main valley. We stopped at Summit Meadow, and we let the kids go, and they scared like quail. I was walking with my friend's son. And he and I stumbled on what looked like two bones. The boy had taken it out. I kept trying to get him to leave it alone. I could see the length of the fingers that came out on it. It was pretty obvious that it was a human hand. I knew I had to get a hold of law enforcement, get somebody up there to look at it.
My name is Don Coelho. I'm a retired National Park Ranger. In June of 1983, I got a radio call from another park ranger. sick family and some children found what they felt were partial human remains. Summit Meadow was my area of responsibility. That's located on the Glacier Point Road, and that is the road that goes out to one of the most spectacular scenes in the National Park Service. I was concerned immediately, and to be honest with you, I was hoping it was going to be a bear paw all the way up there. I was really hoping this wasn't human remains, and without seeing it yet, I didn't know one way or the other. The only way to find out is go out and take a look. I had medical training, and when I saw it, I realized this was not a bear paw. This is part of a human being. Is this a homicide? Is it a suicide? A missing person we didn't know about? I called in other rangers to help me. I took over the crime scene itself, and Kim took over identifying what our evidence was at that point.
My name is Kim Tucker, and I was one of the two primary investigators on the Summit Meadow case. We had no idea of the who, what, when, where, why, or how this Anne had come to Summit Meadow.
At this point, we secured the meadow. We didn't know what was out there. Part of the forearm and the hand were lying exposed near some running water and mud in the meadow. There was a light-colored Band-Aid, not still on the finger, but touching one of the fingers. It obviously been frozen and thawed, which is normal in the meadow at that time of the year. We were hoping we would get a blood sample or a hair sample that might tell us male, female, maybe race, maybe not. It was obvious it wasn't fresh.
It was a true mystery.
The challenge was we're out in a wilderness area in a national park. You're not on a city street somewhere.
Some of us went through the Las Vegas Police Academy, I being one of them. We were taught about a lot of the crimes that were going on in Las Vegas. We do ride-alongs and so forth. But now coming to Yosemite, very similar things were occurring, but they were occurring in a very rural wilderness environment. You're talking wilderness.
In wilderness areas, a person can walk off a cliff. A person could fall into a crevasse or down a creek bed, and nobody knows where they are.
You could encounter partial bodies that were found by visitors that may have been predated on by wildlife, bears, coyotes, or whatever. You could have individuals who had been raped or beat up, and maybe they are on a trail. So you really had to investigate the scene. You had to investigate it and do all that you can to determine what is this puzzle telling us.
Whenever you find any human remains, you always assume foul play unless proven otherwise.
Our job next would be to start looking for the body.
We called the Mariposa County Search and Rescue volunteer teams, and a lot of their volunteers were teenagers.
If somebody found something, it would be photographed, cataloged, taken as evidence. I felt there has to be something else around here.
Maybe somebody would find some piece of evidence, something that could give us the next clue. Anything that might help us learn who is this person, how did they arrive here, when did they arrive here.
We found a lot of bones inside dens for bobcats, dens for bears, dens for coyotes. Turns out none were human.
Well, we knew we had a fatality, but we didn't have any known missing people from the immediate area.
So it was very difficult to think, well, what is the next thing we should do? Soon after the remains were recovered at Summit Meadow, I took the evidence to a forensic anthropologist to provide any information about gender, age, race.
In the Summit Meadow case, all I had was a forearm. I can, with my hands and eyes, examine the bone surface to generate information about an individual's weight, height, race, sex. I told investigators that this is somebody who has died recently. They still had tissue. The hand and the forearm were relatively small, and it appears to be a slightly built female, weighing maybe 110 pounds. Her wrist and her elbow area suggested that she was at least 25 years of age at the time of her death. There was no evidence of cut marks. I couldn't find any. How they died could not be determined.
There are a lot of people that fit that profile, given the information we had available to us. And it would be unlikely we would identify the victim. I thought probably the victim might have died in the fall of 1982, but I thought it was conceivable that the bone had been out there for at least a year. I came from a conservative rural background. My father worked for the Forest Service, and we lived in very remote areas of Northern California. I just turned 19 when I started working for the National Park Service. I was the only woman working in the office at the time. The winter of 1974, my supervisor had gone to the FBI Academy. While he was there, he was asked, we're getting pressure to get women into law enforcement in National Park Service. Do you know anyone who might want to go to the law enforcement training center? I said, well, maybe my secretary. That's where I was headed. The 70s in Yosemite were very much like 70s elsewhere, I think. There were a lot of social forces changing. You know, the war in Vietnam, civil rights movement, you had the women's equality movement. But it was a pretty tumultuous period of time for the country.
During the 1970s, early 80s in Yosemite, there was a lot of drug use, drug sales, and drug-related crime. There was a lot of that kind of craziness. I started in 1974. Because I was a criminal justice major, they put me undercover immediately. Everything from violence to sexual assault. Criminals go on vacation too.
There was a small number of people working together in the law enforcement office at that time. There were 3 permanent investigators, myself and 2 others. Our attention was on the Summit Meadow case. But we had very little to work with.
We had a bifurcated case. Who is the victim? How did the victim die? There's no DNA. The internet hadn't been invented yet. It was all phone calls. It was all paper. We wanted to find the rest of that person to let somebody's family know that their loved one was found in Yosemite.
We have visitation in Yosemite from all over the world. Someone could come from anywhere.
Does anybody know if somebody who went to Yosemite and never came back? Does anybody have a car parked at a trailhead outside the park? Or any other vehicles that were unattended that possibly could be related to this?
Over a year's time in Yosemite, we would get half a dozen possibly missing people. Some would be runaways. Some would be who came up with their boyfriend. But some would be to do away with themselves because they felt they couldn't face the life they had lived wherever they came from.
We did have a young teenager who'd been reported missing in July of 1981 at another location in the park. Her name was Stacey Harris. She had gone hiking to one of the backcountry High Sierra camps with her father.
There was a highly suspicious disappearance of a girl up in the Sunrise area. It doesn't fit a place that someone would normally disappear in an evening in a location in a backcountry environment where there's other people around, but you're far away from civilization.
She went missing from a section of the park that is off the Tioga Pass Road. That was quite a distance from Summit Meadow. She would have had to have gotten out onto a main road, somehow gotten to a very different environment in the park. I thought it was unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that the remains that were found in Summit Meadow were the missing person from July of 1981. I ruled her out, and I think most other people did too.
We had to get word out to other agencies and other departments.
We searched with the California Department of Justice. We searched on a national database.
Kim and I realized that if we had a homicide, we don't know where that murderer is.
Yosemite National Park and likely others can attract people who are drifters, who are not known, don't want to be known.
Crime increased dramatically in California from 1960 into the mid-80s, and this thing called stranger violence. That's violent crime that occurs amongst people that don't know each other. So that's the scariest kind of crime.
In the 1970s and the 1980s, there were a number of serial killers that were operating in California. Based on the data, there really did seem to be a rise in these serial killers. Particularly serial sexual killers whose motivation is for sex. And typically their victims are people that they don't know. These are strangers to them. These are what we call human predators. They drive around literally looking for new victims. And that was really a phenomenon that had not really existed or been identified before the 70s and then into the 80s.
At that point, as an investigator, you keep searching, asking questions, but we have negative results. Just a lot of dead ends. Once the snow came in, that was it. There was no way we could get back up and do any more searches at all.
We've had no inquiries from other agencies, other people. We just have to wait. I think it's what any of these officers around the world talk about, a cold case. So you have to triage your time, your energy, your resources. But that doesn't mean you ever stop thinking about it. In the spring of 1984, we were contacted by the California Department of Justice, and they said they had a person who was claiming to have been responsible for homicides in many jurisdictions all over the country. He said he had murdered people in Mountainous National Park in California. So, of course, Yosemite could be that Mountainous National Park.
When I got Kim's call, she was obviously excited that we may have a break in the case.
So that's how we first learned of Henry Lee Lucas.
In the spring of 1984, Kim called and said they have a new lead there's this serial killer who's confessing to killing people all over the United States. It's Henry Lucas.
We had no knowledge about Henry Lucas at all. Is he telling the truth? Don and I were both feeling like he could be responsible for this unidentified woman in Yosemite.
My name is Phil Ryan. I'm a retired Texas Ranger. What the Texas Rangers do is assist local law enforcement. You have an assigned territory. Mine was 4 counties. One of my counties was Montague, and it was one of my poorer counties. Montague is a real small town. The sheriff called me about a missing person in September 1982. He felt like foul play might have been involved. It was an 82-year-old woman named Kate Rich out of Ringo, Texas. And her daughters hadn't heard from her, and they noticed that she had a pet cat that hadn't been fed, and that never happens with Kate. So we started out initially just surveying the house. Then, highway department employee found her purse on the side of the road. So that told me that she's dead. We just got to find her body. We got contacted by 2 or 3 daughters of Kate Richards, and they said that they'd run a guy by the name of Henry Lee Lucas and a little girl by the name of Becky Powell out of their mom's house.
They were supposed to keep the house clean and do her bookkeeping. What the relatives discovered was they were siphoning funds.
Henry was 46, Becky was 15 years old, and they were passing themselves off as husband and wife.
Becky Powell was a little girl who came from a dysfunctional family where there was nothing most of us would consider a normal lifestyle. She gravitated toward Henry, we think, because he watched after her. He would take care of her. I think the relationship started that way.
Lucas, at that time, was living in the House of Prayer. It was an old chicken farm that was turned into a church. First thing I did with my part of the investigation was interview everybody at the House of Prayer church. That's when I also found out that Becky Powell was also missing. Henry left with her and came back without her. We pulled up there, and I told him we were investigating the missing Kate Richards. He said, "Oh no, I love that woman." Henry was unkept, usually had body odor, and he had one eye. My sense is Henry had a low IQ, but a high street smart and conning people. He kept changing his story. He told me Becky had left and went to Florida. And he said Kate and Becky both were in California with Kate Rich's daughter. I knew he was lying. In the back of my mind, I thought that Henry got mad and killed Becky. And then Kate figured it out. And then he had to kill her. I could prove he was lying, but there's no evidence. What do? You know? I knew only a confession was my best bet. Eventually, found out that Henry had been in possession of a firearm. In Texas, if you're a convicted felon, it's against the law.
When he was arrested, he says he was put in a cold cell. And that was to get him so uncomfortable that he finally said to the jailer, "I've done some bad things." And he wanted to record it.
She said, "I can take you to where Becky's body is. It's not a pretty sight, but I can only show you what's left of Kate.
Like you tell me you're full necklace. What happened that night? Me and Becky got in an argument about going back to Florida. We kept arguing and cussing each other, and she hauled off, hit me upside the head, and then that was it. That's when I hit her with a knife. I hit her right in the chest. But I doubt if she even knew what did it, really. Do you recall what you did next? Yes, I took her panties and her bra off. I had sexual intercourse.
He told me that he had this problem with desiring dead people, sexual dead people, and animals.
It's one of those things that I guess it got to be a part of my life.
You've got to mask your feelings as best you can when you're taking confessions. But some of that stuff makes you want to reach across the table and strangle them.
What happened next? Well, after that, I cut her up in little teeny pieces.
Try not to damage the metal the best we can. We've got a human being laying dead out there. We don't know really whatever happened to her.
This was not just some isolated individual that not another soul on this planet cared about. It was hard. Solid metal is not so heavily trafficked. There are locations where you can get in tree cover, where you're not likely to be observed.
It could be a great place to do a body dump because animals in the wilderness start feeding on human remains and destroy evidence. It doesn't mean that person was killed in the national park. They could have been killed anywhere and dropped off there.
I sat here and just took my time looking into the forest to see if the remains were here, then could there be a body up there?
Right.
We didn't know if it was a crime of violence where they chopped the arm off and threw the limbs away from the road.
What happened next? Well, after that, I cut her up in little teeny pieces. I hope that you can find all of her. That's what I hope. Like I say, I didn't leave her in no pretty sight.
Henry walked me out to a murder scene of Becky was, and he told me if you dig right here, you'll find a pillowcase with some of her in it, and then her legs will be out in this direction, her head's in this direction, and we were able to locate the whole body. Henry said he disposed of Becky's suitcase up by the railroad tracks, and we go up there and we find it. Suitcase, some of her clothes. There was a mathematics book that she had been teaching herself. And we were reading that book, and it was bringing you to tears. You could tell she was a lonely, misunderstood, or abused girl. You're wishing you could have known about all that and got her out of that.
With Kate Rich, he killed her and then he burned her body in a makeshift stove out beside the shack where he was living.
Well, that experience like? Just like burning wood. But getting wood in the stove. How did you get pieces small enough to fit inside of the stove when you're talking about I stuffed the whole body in the stove?
I did not personally know Kate prior to this, but I talked to family members enough to where you get a sense of her. By all accounts, she was nice to people and lived a fairly meager life. She lived a ripe age, but Nobody wishes that kind of death on a family member or any human.
When did you start getting handy with a knife?
I started when I was a kid. I think life was ever since I can remember.
My name is Mike Cox. In 1983, I was a police reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. I come from a family of journalists. My grandfather was a newspaper man, and my parents were both newspaper people. I just didn't know any better. The Austin Police Department had a press room, and I seldom even went to the office. I would go straight to the police station in the morning and listen to the police monitor. So one morning I hear that they've got a guy in jail up in North Texas who claims that he's killed 2 women and has sex with the bodies after they're dead. And it looks like it's a pretty big story. When I got there, Lucas was about to be arraigned, but I looked on that more as an interruption more than anything else, because an arraignment is a pretty routine procedure.
He was asked by the judge, "Do you understand that you're being charged with murder?" And he tells the judge, "Yes, sir. I got about 100 of them out there."
All of a sudden, Lucas just blurts out, "What about those 100 other women that I killed?" And as you might imagine, that got my attention pretty quickly. So as soon as it was over with, I wrote my story in the hotel room, and the next morning had a banner story in the Austin American-Statesman about Lucas. The Associated Press picked it up, and it went nationwide and worldwide.
When the story that there might be a serial killer in Monte County Jail broke, the town has never seen so many helicopters, news media trucks, news reporters.
In Texas, a former mental patient, Henry Lee Lucas, says he's a mass murderer. So far, he's led police to the bodies of 2 women, and he claims he has killed many more.
You're trying to get friendly and volunteer. Got these 2 people here going to witness your signature. I'm signing your full name there just like this.
Henry said victims were easy. He found mostly women who were stranded with their cars, were separated from a group.
Every night when I would leave to go home, I would give him a legal pad. I said, "If you think of anything, write it down for me."
And then he started drawing pictures of women that he claimed to have killed.
They would draw victims' faces and he'd tell where they'd be, what town they was in, and he would pass those out. Sure, we can get these confirmed,
Lucas said, "I've been killing everything I can for the last 10 years.
I've been doing this since about 75 on Saturday.
The murders that we know Henry committed were gruesome enough to indicate that, he wasn't a rookie. He had a fetish that was pretty bloody.
There were a lot of things about him that perfectly fit the profile of a serial killer. How casually he would talk about, sticking a knife in somebody.
What does it feel like when you have a knife in somebody? How big wood will be there? How big? Fantastic.
And like any good sociopath, which I think he was, he could be very personable.
Oh, yeah, she's good. He has pretty fast, right? What kind of ball?
When you're working serial killers, they sort of get their own MO. And best I could tell with Henry, it was easy catches on the side of the road of females, more likely stabbed. And serial killers can operate like that if there's no connection to the victim and the killer. Where he messed up, he killed 2 that he had a connection to.
People don't do the things that do must do something wrong.
Lucas was born and raised near Blacksburg, Virginia, to a very poor family. His father had been a railroad worker and lost both of his legs. He just bumped along on his ass, I believe is the way Henry put it when he told me about his father.
His mother, Alicia, was a prostitute and turned tricks in front of him when he was a young boy.
The trauma he experienced at the hands of his mother, who physically, emotionally abused him horrifically, really damaged him as a young boy.
He had a terrible upbringing, playing with his brother in a pocket knife. He lost one of his eyes. They eventually gave him a glass eye, but that one eye was always sort of droopy, so it was easy to tell that he had a prosthetic eyeball.
I guess you would say a poor family. They didn't have anything, and I stole for food, and I made bootleg liquor for a living. My mother was a prostitute, and my dad, he was a drunk. They would make me steal for food and stuff, and if I refused to do it, I was beaten for it.
His mother would beat him with a broom. She had done that his whole childhood, growing up with her, and it became a trigger. She hit him, is what he claimed, and he stabbed her in the neck. And when he saw her fall, he was so scared and shocked by what he'd done that he ran.
He was arrested for that. And while he was in the penitentiary, he did some time in a mental hospital.
He was interviewed extensively by a prison psychiatrist, and he was released around 1970.
When Henry was told he was going to be released because of overcrowding, his response was that he wasn't ready. They forced him out of the prison. Before he left, he told them, "You will be sorry if you make me leave."
We went on several local tours in Texas, and the sheriff would take custody of him and see if he could find his crime scene.
We're still talking to Henry about the Patricia and Jones case from Houston.
All of the officers that I ever talked to about it marveled at his ability to say, okay, turn left here, turn right here.
What'd you say now? I said, it seems like it's area. Okay. What do you mean by this is the area? You saying this is where you later, or you went through here, or what do you mean by that? I believe this is where she was at, where I left her at. Right in here? See if I on her back. Could you get inside of the car?
I did talk to a fair number of cops whose integrity I trust, and they all said he led us to the scene.
The body was back in behind the tree to stand up straight. The head was facing that way. He was sticking out his head right up in my car.
They went on all kinds of back roads. They started miles from the site, and Henry got them there.
I'm satisfied with that place. If I have a victim in a certain location, I won't put another victim in that location. I'll move that victim somewhere else across the United States.
Calls started coming from everywhere, from officials who wanted to interview Henry for potential crimes in their areas.
Oklahoma, Louisiana, Florida, New Mexico, Chicago, Colorado, California. We had about 1,000 officers come in and talk to him, look at his MO, look at where he was at the time their homicide occurred. We set up a task force, and I was assigned to head it, just to assist agencies from other jurisdictions that had unsolved homicides.
It might be a little difficult
you know, remember some of these things. The actual year we're talking about is back in 76.
Once they got to the interview, they received a list of instructions from Bob Prince about how to talk to Henry.
When the investigators would come, I'd always advise them, don't believe him if you can't confirm it. And if he can't confirm it, he's not a credible person.
We don't want anything out of you that's not true and accurate, as best you can recall.
He knew details that people were stunned about.
That lifted the axe up. She kept trying to fight to get away from it. I hauled and hit her.
He did seem to know details that only the killer would have known.
The second blow would have been between the shoulder blades, which I caught her as she was running towards the front door.
He would know what magazine was on the bedside table.
I started going through everything in the bedroom. Dresser, vanity, closet.
Henry was guiding them to a crime site in West Virginia and said, I remember the muffler on our car fell off. And they all looked around, and in the brush, they found an old muffler.
He was a walking Rand McNally of the United States. He'd been on every road there ever was.
What kind of car did you use when you committed this? I was driving a 73 Pontiac Cadillac. It was maroon with a cream top. Where did you leave this vehicle? San John's, New Mexico.
If the law enforcement agent had contacted us on murders and had some evidence, we would send out to Lucas's information, a copy of fingerprints and pubic hair. The boy enjoyed giving me pubic hair. I don't know why.
Well, the first thing I started killing when I was a kid, I used to take out shooting. How old were you? Beginning with the first time you killed us? 14.
There were cases where they did actually file charges against him, but I think there were others that would just, were considered cleared by his confession that he had done it.
How many murders do you feel like you have committed previously in the state of Texas?
I've estimated 60, but I know there's more than 60.
I don't think there's a doubt he did kill a lot of people. Lucas was convicted of 11 homicides, including his mother, and he actually went to trial and he was convicted. And we consider that one level of certainty.
The numbers of murders that he claimed just kept going up and up and up.
From the very beginning, authorities have been skeptical of Lucas's confessions. Yet in the course of interviews with 450 law enforcement officers from 30 states, Lucas has so far been positively linked to approximately 150 murders. He was constantly traveling. He said in an interview once, my urge, I couldn't quit it. It was a killing spree, 75 to 83.
You're going to find your victims in many places. You pick the type of home where it's isolated, or you have to pick them right off in the road. A person that you know that's not going to cause you any kind of problems later on.
This case began for us in Yosemite in June of 1983. We had no clue as to who the victim might have been. In the summer of 1984, Henry had listed a number of places across the country where he was reporting that he had committed homicides. And one place that he specified was a mountainous national park in California.
At that point, we didn't really know that much about serial killers. You might see something on TV every once in a while or read something in the paper about it, but I didn't really equate it with that.
That was probably my first introduction to an active serial killer that could be real and that could be here. According to the Texas Rangers investigative files,
Henry Lucas and Becky Powell were living with Kate Rich's daughter in Hemet, California between January and May of 1982. In September of 1982, he had a vehicle that was impounded by local authorities in Needles, California.
We searched Henry's car that was abandoned and found a knife and some blood.
It was really critical that the Texas authorities were able to confirm that Henry Lucas had been residing in an area of California that was within a 6 to 8 hour drive from Yosemite National Park during the time period we believe our victim was killed.
About 5% of my cases is sexual murder. What do you mean by sexual? That's why they were killed. And sexual.
We just started talking about it. I tried to think, well, what are we really dealing with here?
This was the beginning of a circus that would never leave town.
The fact that we might be able to interview the person responsible for the Soto Jane Doe, and that was mind-blowing.
I have specifically, across the United States, left evidence to show that I was doing the crime.
Secrets in the wild, brutal murders, beautiful yet treacherous places. These are the stories of the investigators who solve crimes in the wilderness.
We had a human being laying dead out there. How did she get there?
Henry Lee Lucas has been confessing that he may have done a homicide in Yosemite.
Isn't for bringing him here was for local law enforcement to solve these crimes.
My victims never knew what was going to happen.
He started talking about the little triangle signs.
This guy has been at the crime scene.
I was told to not do anything further with the case. I was done.
Then the Dallas Morning News published the expose. Some of those confessions were bogus.
That Lucas could not have been the killer in all the cases.
I realized that there was a murderer out there, and we don't know where that murderer is.
And then the skull was found.
Yosemite is magnificent. It's mammoth. And it's humbling. It's a magical place to any of us that have worked there.
I would go out into a meadow, just lay there, looking up at the stars or the sky, and I would say, I'm getting paid to do this.
From the giant sequoias to the waterfalls to the sublime evenings in the high country at sunset. It's an amazing place. I met my wife and was married in Yosemite National Park at the base of Yosemite Falls. So it almost feels like home to me. I was working the south end of the park. And one day in 1984, Kim Tucker calls me and says, we've got this detective from Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and they have a person who's confessing to killing people in national parks.
He didn't say, yeah, he did it at a certain time, a certain place, but he did say he had killed many victims in different scenarios at a Mountainous National Park in California. We all sat down and just started talking about it. We just intuitively couldn't match a case with what he was saying, other than the potential of the Summit Meadow case.
I can't speak for Ken, but at that point, I had never heard of Henry Lucas.
When Jim Boutwell first arrested Henry, he was convinced that Henry knew about killing. He knew it because of the crimes he'd already confessed to. He killed his mother, stabbed her in the neck. He killed his common-law wife, Becky Powell, 15 years old, stabbed her in the chest, and then he dismembered her. With Kate Rich, he killed her, and then he burned her body in a makeshift stove out beside the shack where he was living.
He was callous. He was indifferent to the suffering of victims. He had no long-range plans. He used people to gratify his personal needs, and he was sadistic. So it made him a very, very dangerous man.
In Texas, Lucas has been charged in 22 murders and has received 7 sentences so far. He's under the death penalty for a Williamson County murder, serving 4 life sentences for murders in Denton, Kaufman, and Montgomery counties, and has 2 75-year terms for killings in Montague and Terry counties.
Henry was guilty of committing murders across the country, not just Texas, but in other states as well.
I've had shootings, knifings, strangulations, beatings, and I've participated in actual crucifixions of humans. All across the country, these people just like me set out to destroy human life.
As Lucas started confessing to more and more crimes, his fame grew.
When I was hired to work on the Article for Life magazine, it was the first of its kind, a feature on serial killing. It was considered a new phenomenon.
You can't help wondering how many people like him might be loose in America right now, killing without being caught.
You're absolutely right.
Lucas got national and international media attention. He did become a celebrity. He did live TV interviews.
I've tracked him from over the United States almost. I'd follow him on the highway. I'd go around, play with him, back up, and let them go by me. A woman alone ain't safe at all.
Mr. Lucas, what you say sends a chill through my bones. I do nothing but travel alone.
Yeah. But just think if I was out there.
People are fascinated with serial killers. We know there's evil and danger in the world, but if we can encapsulate it in a name and an identity, somehow that helps us understand it.
Everybody at a point was caught up in Henry Lee Lucas. I think Lucas enjoyed the notoriety that he had achieved. You know, for the first time, he really amounted to something.
Henry was asked why he had confessed to all the crimes. Henry's response was, look at all the friends I've got. I never had those before. Now I've got friends.
I was the special assistant to the Attorney General of California, a man named John Vandekamp.
Based on the corroboration that we've obtained thus far, we're talking now about 175 murders around the country, 15 here, maybe more. To my knowledge, it's by far and away the greatest mass murder committed by any single individual in this country.
I think he claimed in California, we're talking about dozens of murders. California police, their
pressure and their passion is to clear their cases. They don't care what's going on in Texas.
It became very apparent that agencies weren't communicating with each other. There was territorial issues, and there was nobody really able to put together, wow, we just had 2 deaths in this county, and hey, there's another one up in a park. Gee, I wonder if we have somebody traveling around killing people.
He learned in his early years that successful criminals did not have identifiable MOs. So he did stabbing, strangulation, the use of guns, mutilation, necrophilia, decapitation. You name it, he did it.
We see the same cycle over and over again where they go through terrible abuse, and in the end, they present themselves as powerful people. I'm a powerful person. I'm someone important. Pay attention to me. I've killed a lot of people.
That was death on women. I didn't feel they need to exist. I hated them, and I wanted to destroy everyone I could find.
My take on Henry Lee Lucas was that he enjoyed killing, enjoyed the creation of misery, that he somehow derived pleasure from this, and that he was the personification of evil.
So now we have some missing people. Yes, we have some remains of a human. We need to go figure out what's going on here. Could he possibly have been the person there that killed somebody at Saba Meadow?
I don't remember any time in my life ever hearing about an agency saying, we'll bring the killer to you. But they did.
They told us they were bringing him to California. He was going to have a tour in California.
It's called a tour. It's a little sensationalistic, but it was somewhere between 10 days and 2 weeks. Covered a lot of mileage, I think about several thousand miles within California. But it was essentially the last 10 days to 2 weeks in August.
So you went down that way?
Yeah. The California Department of Justice worked with the state of Texas justice officials to bring him to California because there were many cases that were unsolved.
The Attorney General used his office to make it happen. We didn't know whether this was going to bear fruit.
Lucas was with a sheriff's detective, and they were going to drive around to different spots where he led the investigators to places that he committed crimes.
Yeah, I remember they did those things safely. That was up this way on down the road.
Just to see the kind of areas. Some were open fields, some were homes or apartment complexes.
December 4th, Elizabeth Mary Wolfe, 27, was brutally stabbed to death in her apartment in Davis. Lucas led officers to the apartment house and was able to satisfy officers that he had definitely committed the crimes.
They did not bring him to Yosemite. We ended up meeting with him in the Sacramento County Jail end of August of 1984.
Because his notoriety and what he said he'd done, there was a lot of security.
Until I actually sat down face to face with him, I had no idea what he was like personally.
I wasn't expecting some frothing maniac screaming in a jail cell, but he looked just a normal late 40-year-old man who, in this case, he was a suspect in multiple homicides.
If he had been cleaned up, had clean clothes on, had a good haircut, brushed his teeth, it wouldn't have thought anything of it.
He looked normal until he opened his mouth, and then you could tell that there was something off here.
I got your bodies at night outside haunts.
Do the authorities know about those?
And they're 2 girl detectives. Both killed at the same time.
When he talked about killing people, like you and I might be talking about what we had for breakfast this morning, he was cold and matter of fact. He said, well, you're a park ranger. You know, I have to kill people.
I was up to
I see what they call it. You subsidize national forest. I mean, yeah.
Yosemite?
Yeah. I had one that I dropped off someplace. She was just stabbed to death and thrown down the car right along the hard road.
And all of a sudden it really hit home. This guy might be for real. We have very limited time. Take your number. You have an hour to talk to Henry Lucas. So we knew we were going to have to interview him again.
We didn't want to plant information with him. We wanted to hear what he had to say and then take the information that he gave us and see if we could make that match what we knew of our own case.
I had a map of one of the park brochures saying, okay, if you came into Yosemite, do you remember which road you drove in on?
He was pretty cagey. I did think he was trying to evaluate us and probably every other officer who talked with him.
Kim was one of very few investigators who were female.
I was the only woman working in the office at the time.
Honestly, there were people that did not feel women should be in this type of a occupation.
You still had some egos that wanted to resist having women, but I think if you think about Gina Rousseau or Kim Tucker, those rangers brought a certain kind of enforcement style that was less intimidating.
There are a number of times in this case where Henry reacted a little bit more openly to Kim than me as a man.
We were encouraged that Henry would probably do better if we brought some cigarettes. I was lighting cigarettes for him. I was pouring drinks for him. I mean, I was thinking, he's probably enjoying all this personal service.
He indicated that he had picked up a female hitchhiker out of the park.
I'm pretty sure I can do. She was on the road hitchhiking, and I picked her up.
In a town or?
I'm down from her. About 25 miles, I guess, from where they was at.
Typically, the victims of the stranger violence were people that were vulnerable and people that were outside alone.
The hitchhiking culture in those days, whether you were a hippie or a hippie wannabe, hitchhiking was the cool thing to do. It was normal to see people hitchhiking, whether it be off of freeways or in the mountains.
There were people that were up and down the coastline, and just because of the culture and the time, it wasn't unusual for them to trust people and just go with them after they just met them for a short period of time.
They described her as being a hitchhiker, white female, 17 to 18 years old, 5'2", 110 pounds. And I thought the description would fit the profile of our victim.
He wasn't real specific. He thought possibly she was blonde. His statement was that they had consensual sex. After they had sex, he strangled her, left her there with shrubs and brush over.
Strangled her.
That's all.
That was her hands. And I took her from there, picked her up, carried her on back in the edge of the brush in there, and threw her down.
I felt like he was trying to provide information that would keep the conversation going, because we'd light him a couple cigarettes.
When you're in prison, particularly in prison for life or on death row, a milkshake, a steak at Sizzler is the height of luxury. And Lucas got a lot of that.
He was the star of the show.
wasn't enough where we felt, aha. There's no aha moment there at all.
I noted in my report that he mispronounced the word Yosemite.
Well, they call it Yosemite.
And it made me wonder, does he really know what he's talking about?
We didn't want to draw any conclusions at that point. One of the things that you want to do is you keep your mind completely open.
We had enough to make us think, well, we need to look at him further. If there is more investigation that we can do, we need to do it.
There's a tremendous pressure, both then and now in law enforcement, to clear cases. In some places, it's even the metric by which success is measured. Every police agency in the United States has unsolved murders. And for many police entities, they hate that even worse than having tried somebody and lost the case, because the case is not pinned down. Some of it is very human to identify a victim and be able to bring some degree of finality and resolution.
The major reason for bringing him here was for local law enforcement to solve these crimes, to clear them up, as Lucas said himself, so that at least the families would know finally what had happened to their particular loved ones.
But with the books closed on 15 murders, there are dozens more in which Lucas is a suspect. California authorities believe if they can bring him back from Texas again, they'll find many more who fell victim to the hands of death.
We went back and we talked with the Assistant United States Attorney in Fresno, Ivan Abrams.
The name Henry Lucas was familiar to me already. I was aware of the universe of serial killers. The Rangers and I discussed how we could develop the case and what we would need to have a prosecutable case. Today, we'd have the DNA, we'd have an identification, fairly decent case. But this was before DNA analysis was very well developed. We had a confession of sorts, but there were things missing. One of the things I know I wanted was an identification, if possible, of the victim.
The United States Attorney's Office, we're very interested in pursuing it, but not so much in the other units of the park.
Managers didn't want these heinous crimes, information that occurred in their park to get out because it's going to suppress visitation.
There was certainly an interest in not fanning any kind of flame that Yosemite or other parks were a dangerous place to be.
But Henry told us enough where it appears that he had visited Yosemite. We've got the human remains of Summit Meadow. We realized that we've got to talk to our bosses so we can go to Texas so we could spend as much time as we wanted with them.
There was resistance from my immediate supervisor, but the chief ranger for the park did support the whole effort.
We needed to get another unit in as soon as we could.
I had never been to Texas.
We went to the Georgetown, Texas jail where the Texas Rangers had him in custody. And they were expecting us. They had an interview room set up for us.
There's a case in California in the national park. Officers from any agency could come and had a legitimate reason to talk to him.
The Texas Rangers were very welcome. I remember Bob Prince pretty vividly.
They asked us if we were armed, and I said no, because we weren't allowed to fly armed at that point. And this Texas Ranger said, well, you got to be armed if you're going to go interview Henry Lucas. He goes, here, take my gun. That was the first of like, wow, okay, this is kind of different.
I consider him very dangerous. Had extremely quick hands, and I also advise each officer, make sure that you don't let your weapon be close to him.
They had Henry come out of the cell, and he remembered us.
We thought we could probably prompt his discussion or maybe his memory by showing him some photographs. And we had the map of the area.
One thing we did show him was the picture of the view from Glacier Point, Half Dome, Yosemite Valley, just a beautiful view in general, thinking that would stir his recollection. And it did. He said, yeah, I remember seeing it. So at that point, we asked him, did you still have the victim with you? Oh, yeah. And I said, okay, describe where you stopped. And he drew us a really sketchy little map as to his best recollection of where they stopped.
He provided further description about how the crime occurred.
They decided they were just going to have lunch. In one statement, he said he had 4 cans of Budweiser beer and fried chicken wrapped up in tinfoil. He said they had beers and then they had sex. And then he said it was time to go. She indicated that she didn't want to leave. So he said, well, then I'll just leave you here. And then he said I strangled her, killed her.
Strangling is a particularly personal way of killing people. Hands-on, strangling and looking somebody in the eye. You have to be incredibly sick to do this kind of stuff.
He said he left some food wrappers, and there was a canteen at the site and part of a jacket, the victim's jacket. He was providing further description about the scene. But I also, sitting there, I thought, well, he could be guessing. He could be recounting something he's told somebody else, and it's generic enough that it could fit something else.
I said, what was remarkable about the area? Nothing. It was a field. And then he said, oh, I do remember one thing, is there were these signs nailed up in the trees, about 10, 15 feet up in the trees. I'm thinking, what are you talking about? Signs? And he said, yeah, they had numbers on them. Light bulb went off with me. Those are what's called Nordic ski trail signs for backcountry Nordic skiers.
Don and I both knew what those were. We thought, well, that's something that an ordinary person, if they hadn't been there, wouldn't have commented on.
I mean, I must have driven up that road 1,000 times while I was working there. You don't just go nail signs at trees in a national park. The only place that we had any signs in the trees there were the Nordic ski trails. So I'm thinking, oh my God, that would be Summit Meadow. That would be the spot. It's like, this guy has been to the crime scene. That's when it hit us. I'm pretty sure I went like that to you. And I think, because my mind was going a mile a minute. At that point, I'm thinking, I got to get back to Summit Meadow. I got to get back there now.
We both reconvened in the park, I think on November 1st. We pulled up to an area that it was a natural place to pull off the road, and there are not a lot of pullouts there. I think both Don and I realized that it was the pullout described by Henry Lucas.
I got out of the car and looked up. That was the real aha moment. Oh my God, there's what he's talking about right there. There's the Nordic ski trail signs right there in the trees. We followed the creek bed up to the tree line, which wasn't very far. Maybe 25, 30, 40 yards at the most, probably.
We went up and looked around at the scene, trying to find the area that he described. And that's where we did find some of the items.
We found a couple of Budweiser beer cans. and a wrapped up piece of tinfoil that obviously animals had kind of chewed on a little bit. It looked like it was a fried piece of a chicken leg. And that was it. We're thinking, okay, here we go.
The canteen was in the same general area.
I think you found it.
Yeah.
I found the canteen. So documented it, photographed it, took measurements. At that point, we found the piece of, it was a piece like this, of a forest green jacket. The nylon those jackets were made of.
I don't know that what we found was proof, but I felt like we had found the scene that he described.
I thought, oh shit, we got him. Wow, I can't believe it. This has got to be the spot. What happens next is I find out the next day that Tim has been removed from the case.
I was told to not do anything further with the case.
I was mortified. I went to my boss and said, listen, I need Kim back here to help me. She sat there with these interviews with Henry Lucas. We actually have to have Kim involved. My boss said, well, I'll see what I can do. He wasn't successful.
They did not want to have people who were working full-time as criminal investigators. And when you have a case like this, it was a full-time job that would have had a different pay and benefit package that had been previously made available to rangers. What they were trying to do was prevent a tidal wave of employees seeking pay and benefits of a law enforcement officer in the federal government.
The conflict in the National Park Service at that time was that there was management who felt that the function of a ranger was a generalist. They should not specialize.
Kim and Don with some other of their colleagues were amongst a small number of people doing that specialized work at a time which that kind of specializing in law enforcement wasn't the direction the agency wanted to go.
That was it for me.
Of course, I'm standing thinking, this is a deer in the headlights look. I need another ranger to help me, or another investigator. Now what do I do?
I transferred into the concessions management branch of the park. Kim, when she was pulled from that serial killer's case, she's a good friend. She was feeling embarrassed that her status as an investigator was diminished.
Of course she felt demoted. Anybody would. When somebody walks up and says, give me your gun and your credentials, that's devastating.
She's a pioneer, and sometimes pioneers that are going to create something better for the future may have to go through crap like this.
To have someone as talented as Kim be displaced, it was like, well, what chance have any of the rest of us?
Within a year, I left the Park Service and I was hired as a special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
When Don eventually left, the active part of the investigation stalled.
They are called serial killers, mass killers, recreational killers. Some authorities estimate they are responsible for more than 2,000 of the 20,000 murders committed in this country every year.
Serial killers come in all shapes and sizes and forms, but they seem to be able to pick their victims tragically so that they can, by and large, get away with it. It turned out there are lots of serial killers, far more than we ever knew about.
Henry Lee Lucas killed at least 175 people around the country during an 8-year spree that only ended when Texas authorities caught him last year.
Hugh Ainsworth was an old-time Dallas journalist. In the early 80s, he worked for the Dallas Times-Herald. He and someone else on the staff, Jim Henderson, started looking into the Lucas case. Early on, they apparently were suspicious that the claims he was making were just simply too outlandish, that could not possibly have traveled as much as he did.
Ainsworth worked for something like a year, interviewing people, collecting information, investigating the records.
They started putting together a timeline of when he claimed to be where, and then they started looking at how long it would take him to drive from point A to point B. He claimed a murder on one day, and the next day, many hundreds of miles away. That certainly calls into suspicion whether he could have actually done that.
There wasn't enough time for him to drive between the two places. You worked very hard showing that there were discrepancies, that he was present at a work site when he confessed that he was somewhere else committing murder. There were a lot of questions of all of the confirmed cases. When Hugh Ainsworth published the expose, everything came to a halt.
Hugh, let's start with you. You wrote the conclusions in the Dallas Times-Herald that there's no way he could have been involved. Tell us just a couple of examples of this.
Well, one example in 1981, when Mr. Lucas is charged with and confessed to killing a woman in Baytown, Texas. 3.5 hours later, he confessed to a killing in Texarkana, Arkansas. And in fact, we found out he was selling scrap metal that day in Jacksonville, Florida.
It was at that point that the district attorney in McLennan County, Vic Feazell, took note. He was uncomfortable with 3 cases confirmed in his county.
The Henry bandwagon was rolling, man, and everybody that could jump on it was jumping on it. And I just said, no, this isn't right.
At that point, a grand jury had been called by Jim Maddox and Vic Feazell to investigate all of these confessions.
The special grand jury met in Waco, Texas today to hear the story of a self-described mass murderer. The question they want answered, is he really?
I can't talk about what the grand jury is thinking and feeling right now, what's being presented to them, but my office definitely has been suspicious. We were able to get witnesses from all over the United States into our grand jury. This lady policeman up in Dallas came down with a fake file. A made-up murder with made-up pictures, and Henry confessed to it. The DA in Little Rock, he had prosecuted a murderer in Little Rock and had convicted him. Next thing we know, here's Lucas confessing to that murder. Once he got into it and they were buying it and he saw how easy it was, he said, I just wanted to make fools out of them.
Back in the 80s, it didn't make sense that someone would plead guilty or confess to these murders that they didn't commit. Psychopaths who are serial sexual killers will embellish and lie about crimes that they didn't commit just to manipulate law enforcement. If you're able to manipulate the police, that's the ultimate in manipulation.
I think the lesson of law enforcement here is don't buy the stuff hook, line, and sinker. Check out everything. Check it out. Just because somebody says they did it doesn't mean they did.
Self-reported information in a case is the most unreliable information.
I was really hoping that these 3 cases he confessed to in Waco, that I could just get him in, get my picture taken with him, get my good PR, close that case, and move on down the road. So I really understand how the locals could have been sucked into this, because they have their own confirmation bias. They want this case to be solved. they'll encode it in a way that confirms their bias. And that's just easy to do. That's human nature.
Investigators can give the offender information unwittingly, and in fact, that's how many interviewers were trained. Show the picture. You give them information. Help to refresh their memory as best as you can. And for most offenders, that might be fine. But for someone like Henry Lee Lucas, you may be giving him the very information he uses to manufacture the case that he never committed.
I didn't want to be letting somebody plead guilty to something they hadn't done. We said there is not enough evidence for an indictment.
Texas's Attorney General says his just completed investigation shows that Lucas could not have been the killer in all the cases, and that law enforcement officers were too willing to accept confessions without checking the facts. There are murderers that are walking the streets today as a result of the unprofessional handling of the Lucas matter.
Remember that in 1985, the accusations against Lucas were being discredited. A lot of us were involved in putting together the original grand tours. We're getting very, very skeptical.
When we talked to him, he confessed to a number of other homicides in East-Sended that just did not exist. We have no record of it. Some of the things he described to us, I mean, were so outrageous. Like, that just didn't happen. This guy's pulling our leg or telling us the truth or what?
My default position on him was he's lying. Yeah. Unless we could corroborate.
Yeah. Our case is circumstantial. I don't think we'll ever have any kind of scientific evidence.
The location, he spent so much time at parks that he could have camped there.
Yeah.
I don't know that was true.
Yeah.
That just means he's been there. That doesn't mean he killed anybody there. Basically, all you got is his confession.
Until he got down to the beer can. Was Budweiser his beer of choice?
Yeah, and that's fact.
Okay.
Beer can, check mark. That green jacket, check mark.
Yeah.
On a scale of 1 to 10, probably a 4. So, you got two things that would keep you churning, but I don't think you're anywhere close.
Although Lucas confessed to a lot of cases in California, and he was taken on the grand tour of a bunch of sites, the bottom line is Henry Lee Lucas was never prosecuted for 98% of the crimes that he admitted to.
The identification of the victim was something that was, I thought, very necessary. We couldn't identify the victim. We came to the conclusion, and this is within the U.S. Attorney's Office, that the case just wasn't ready. And so the case became a long-term, open, unresolved case.
A few years later, I had twins. After I had left the law enforcement ranks. One's a girl and one's a boy. It was a great place to grow up. They had a vibrant school. They lived in a beautiful place. So my life went on.
Somewhere while I was an agent, I got a call one day. I think it was from Kim's boss. Apparently, some visitors were walking on another Nordic ski trail to the edge of the Yosemite Valley. And here's a skull laying on the ground.
The skull was found about the same time my son was born.
It was further west from where we were searching. We're wondering if you think it could could be from the Summit Meadow case. That's maybe something we were expecting. We still want to identify her.
Well, now this is getting closer.
Secrets in the wild, brutal murders, beautiful yet treacherous places. These are the stories of the investigators who solve crimes in the wilderness.
And then the skull was found.
Oh my God. We could maybe start to put a face with a victim now.
Put it out the media with no success.
Lucas did start recanting his murders.
Some of those confessions were bogus.
And then, not too long thereafter, 3 women went missing in Yosemite.
He would follow people. He would stalk them.
There's a family somewhere that their loved one is still missing all these years. They have no idea what happened to her.
We're going to figure this thing out.
We're reverse engineering somebody's identity from their DNA.
They got a name for her. The other half of the case is now wide open.
When I was removed from the case, I thought, okay, I mean, whether I do it or somebody else does it, there's a lot of investigation that needs to be done. But in this particular case, the Summit Meadow case, I always assumed that there was someone who knew the victim. Now, there are probably family members wondering where she is. So it was hard. My husband and I used to talk about it all the time. Do you think they'll ever identify the victim? And then the skull was found.
A visitor found it, and Lee Shackleton contacted me because I was the area ranger. See if we can find anything else, and we went out together to try to locate more remains or evidence. Now, as I understand it, the arm was found on the meadow side, and the skull was discovered on the opposite side of the road, where the ski trail begins to Dewey Point.
Typically in the Sierras, when we see bodies, they get distributed over fairly wide areas. Coyotes will take portions of the body back to their dens.
Kim and I talked. We both thought probably it was associated with the Summit Meadow case. It makes sense. It's a skull. That would be the only other human remains we found besides what we found in the meadow. They did a big search of the area. They didn't find anything more, but they had the skull. There's a family somewhere that their loved one is still missing all these years, and they have no idea what happened to her.
1988, I received a skull from the National Park Service. The skull had been naturally detached from the spinal column. Generally speaking, when people cut through things, they're not surgeons.
If somebody is dismembered or decapitated, typically we're going to see what we call sharp force trauma, cut marks on the bones. You can take apart limbs relatively easily if you know what you're doing, but taking apart a spine is really, really tough to do. Unfortunately, in this case, we don't have spine. We don't have a lot of those areas. So if this person was dismembered, there is no evidence on the bones we do have.
The skull is minus the lower mandible, the jaw, but all the rest of the skull's in fairly good shape. It allows you to make measurements of the length of the skull, the different relationships of the face in terms of other structures on the skull. These numbers are used to make an estimate as to the sex of the individual and possible ancestry. The skull had characteristics that suggested Hispanic. However, this is a call that is made where there's a lot of error. What is Hispanic from a genetic point of view is a complicated issue. So when you say Hispanic, you say that's a possibility. The sex was female, and there was sufficient material to work with to do a facial reconstruction.
Oh my God, we could maybe start to put a face with a victim now.
In late 80s, when this was found, the way they were reconstructing the face was with a clay modeling based on known tissue depths. They would place these markers on different points on the skull, and they built a clay model over the skull based on that assumption of a dark-haired Hispanic. This one had a very dark wig on it. And they put it out to the media. They got some tips. They ran through some possibles with no success at finding someone. It was the early 90s when I first had exposure to the Summit Meadow case. I was assigned to Yosemite, and my supervisor handed me a stack of files of cold cases, old cases. Basically told me while I was learning the ropes here at Yosemite, my job was also to start looking into these and see if any of them were viable cases. There's a few Jane Doe cases over my career, and this one just seemed, I won't say personal, but it kind of latched onto me a little more. We were always pretty comfortable about Henry Lee Lucas being involved with the murder at Summit Meadow. The way Henry Lee Lucas described picking her up hitchhiking and then killing her, dumping her.
Strangler. Okay. I mean, that's all. That was your
And then some big story came out about basically laying out all this evidence where he couldn't have committed all these murders.
Bob Prince, the Texas Ranger coordinating the investigation in Georgetown, told me and anyone who asked that everyone on the task force expected Henry to not want to die. And one day he would claim that the confessions weren't real.
I've killed him in every way there is except poison. There's been strangulations, there's been knifings, there's been shootings, there's been hit and runs.
Everyone involved, from Phil Rand to me, knew that eventually he would turn on us.
Lucas did start recanting his murders. He claimed to have, found religion. He was this righteous Christian person now, and I think that was part of why he started recanting. But he was smart enough to realize that the longer he kept talking and saying things that law enforcement considered useful, the longer it would be before they'd get around to executing him.
There's not one shred of evidence showing that
decided that he hadn't killed anybody, and he claimed that members of the task force had given him the case files, that he could convince the people who came to interview him that he was guilty of their crimes because he'd been coached by the task force. He was an innocent man who had been framed.
Henry Lee Lucas embellished a lot. He claimed a lot of murders he didn't do. He wanted that attention. Look at me, I'm a tough guy. I killed those people. He claimed, I think, 600 victims. But why wouldn't he recount it? He keeps them in the press, keeps the focus on him. He wanted that attention. And I suppose at some point he wanted to save his own life.
There's proof that I haven't done the crimes. I mean, written proof. There's people that know I haven't committed the crimes.
You know, he'd get very emotional sometimes when he's talking about cases. He'd get very emotional when he'd tell you that he's been lying all this time. Which time was he telling the truth? Your guess is good as mine.
Once Henry recanted, it called all of the confirmations, all of the cases into question. Some cases were reopened, but not many.
Finally, in I guess it was 1998, Governor George W. Bush commuted his death sentence to a life sentence.
His confession, now recanted, was the only evidence which linked him to the crime. Today's knowledge about his pattern of lies raises doubt.
He died in prison a short time later.
I know he didn't have any guilt. He had a whole lot of lies he took to grave.
But only he really knew whether he had killed any more than just his mother, just Kate Rich, just Becky Powell, all three of which were horrible murders.
To dismiss him as a suspect is a mistake, in my opinion. I absolutely believe that Henry was guilty of committing murders across the country.
I don't think that an old case could absolutely be ruled out just because Henry Lee Lucas was the suspect. With Henry Lee Lucas, anything is possible.
Henry Lee Lucas recanting and then some of his confessions being disproved threw us for a loop, for sure. So, yeah, we did some digging. We did find a window during this time when he says he picked up this woman that he could have been in California easily. Specifics of the crime scene, specific locations, descriptions, the evidence of the beer cans, which was always a big one for me. There was too much evidence to discount. I wanted to solve this. I wanted to resolve this. Then the hard part really came because we sat for several years, decades, because we had no further leads at that time. At a certain point, you hit the point of diminishing returns. You know, you're putting money and time into it when there's other crimes, other victims that need to be taken care of. I had to call it and put the case back in inactive status. One of the worst things I hated as an investigator is when a case I was working had to be suspended. You can ask folks who worked for me, who worked with me. I hated that. That felt like a failure point. You know, that was rough.
Then a number of years later, we have several murders that occur in Yosemite.
My name is Jeffrey Reinick, and I participated in the location arrest of the Yosemite Killer. The Yosemite murder case began in February of
1999, actually, the day after Valentine's Day. And it was the disappearance of 3 women.
Julie Sugg, her mother Carol, and exchange student Silvina Peloso were last seen alive in mid-February near Yosemite.
Carol was the mom. She was in her 40s. Julie and Silvina were teenagers.
These 3 women were staying in a hotel at Cedar Lodge outside Yosemite.
When 3 women went missing in Yosemite, I and another agent went out there to assist the FBI and local law enforcement to analyze the crime scene.
The case grew into a case of national priority.
The haunting mystery of 3 women who disappeared last month outside Yosemite National Park took another somber turn.
Someone abducted them, murdered the mom and one of the young girls, and then took the daughter to another location where he sexually assaulted and murdered her.
5 months later, Joey Armstrong, who worked in the park, went missing. Eventually, they located Joey's remains in a nearby creek, and she had been beheaded.
Shortly after discovery of her body, Cary Stayner was identified as a suspect. He was a handyman from Cedar Lodge.
Stayner worked at the Cedar Lodge for the past 2 years. It's where the 3 sightseers had stayed and a place Armstrong visited.
Cary Stayner is a very interesting case because he comes from a very, very dysfunctional family to begin with. Cary Stayner was born in 1961 in Merced, California. The Stayner family was already well known publicly because their son Stephen Stayner was abducted in 1972.
Stephen Stayner disappeared on his way home from school in Merced, California. He was 7 years old.
And that had given the family a national attention.
Stephen was abducted by a man, a stranger, a child molester, probably a pedophile, who took him into the mountains and kept him there for 7 years. Stephen and Cary were brothers. Cary was always sort of in the background because the focus was to find Stephen. And for years this went on. So Cary was sort of almost like forgotten about.
There were times where his father was sitting in the family room in a way that indicated he was preparing to take his own life. And when Cary would go up to talk to him, his father would tell him that, my son's gone, who are you?
Then when Stephen reappeared after 7 years, if you look at some of the photographs of him, pictures, you see Cary was in that background. I'm here, but it was always about Stephen.
I was the supervisor of the investigations unit when the Cary Stayner murders occurred. That was 1999. We were loosely involved after the first 3, supporting the FBI. We became very involved when Joey was murdered. Within a few days after her murder, Cary was taken into custody.
They say they have found considerable evidence since discovering Armstrong's decapitated body last Thursday in the park near her home.
My boss was there, and he had asked me to interview Cary Stayner. He was in an interview room. When I went in, Cary was sitting in a chair, and he was facing the far corner of the room. And he said, I've done really bad things, really things where I'm ashamed of myself. I've just done horrible things. I asked him, are you talking about the 3 women from the Cedar Lodge? And he kind of did this long-winded nod. And he indicated there was more. He made some statements that indicated to me that he might be the person
that is responsible for what happened to Joey Armstrong. And I asked him, why did you take her head? Because what he described was he held her head for a while. I believe that Cary Stayner was searching for intimacy. I've learned through the years that two of the most intimate times in life is when you're having relations and if you're holding someone when they die. I believe that he had absolute control of her, that it was a control thing. And I think with the absolute control and the fact that they were alone, this, I believe, is part of his quest to find intimacy. He held all of his victims when they died. No one wakes up in the morning and says, today I'm going to be a killer. You go through this long process, especially those who've been traumatized. It's about taking the power back. He said, I've never told anybody this, but I was molested by my uncle. He was traumatized. So we highly suspect that trauma then would have driven him to fantasize, create sexual fantasies that would be very, very dark, probably harming people. I believe his fantasy started after he was sexually assaulted. He said, sometimes I can sit and think about world peace, and sometimes I think I can kill everybody in the world. I had the opportunity to look at some of his paintings, almost all his paintings, about 15 of them he had done. The paintings were all about women's heads on the ground, in the woods. And then he would have monsters hiding behind the trees. And of course, he was the monster.
Police all over the state are investigating whether Cary Stayner, who's confessed to 4 murders at Yosemite National Park, might be connected to other murders.
When it came to Stayner, there was many investigators involved in that case who believed that these 4 victims were not his first.
I know from experience, most serial sexual killers will start to kill initially in their late teens or early 20s.
Cary Stayner was 37 when he committed his murders at the lodge. And I suspect that he had some practice homicides where he learned from his mistakes. He could have picked up sex workers, he could have picked up hitchhikers. He was always a loner and liked being on his own. He would go to Yosemite National Park. He would know the area. And I suspected in the woods that he would follow people. He would stalk them.
Cary Stayner could be a suspect in the Hallie Osborough case as well.
Hallie Osborough was a woman that was murdered in 1985 in Yosemite Valley. She was hiking down a trail.
She was 18 years old, the daughter of a Danish diplomat. She had come up to Yosemite to spend time in the park. She passed some tourists. They waved at one another and said hi. Moments later, those tourists and others heard screams, horrible screams. They ran toward the screams and found Howell bleeding to death with multiple stab wounds.
It's a brutal blitz attack.
She's not immediately dead. There's efforts made to resuscitate her, but she dies.
They didn't find the knife. They didn't find the guy.
Nothing was found.
Nobody was ever arrested.
Stainer's weapon of choice was a knife, and at least 2 of his victims were killed with a knife, stabbing and beheaded Joey Armstrong.
He used to camp at the campground right near where Hella Olsboro was murdered. So in my mind, he couldn't be ruled out of that murder. We never had the opportunity to interview him or confront him about that.
He could have been in the park doing it in the 80s. I really still felt that Henry Lucas was our suspect, was responsible for it. But was it possible that Cary Stayner had something to do with killing our victim?
He'd have been about 20 at the time, 22, I believe.
Henry Lee Lucas said that he strangled her. Without the body itself, there's no way we could tell if the person was strangled or stabbed or how she died. But we didn't want to give up on that case.
The technology at the time had its limitations. I think we pushed those limitations as far as we could as an agency, and then we had to wait. Throughout my almost 30 years stationed at Yosemite, the Summit Meadow case was always kind of on the back of my mind. Every time I go into the cold case file section, it was sitting right there in big letters staring at me. So when I became a supervisor, I tried to assign one cold case to every agent. Can we make progress on it, given today's technology?
My name is Colin Tucker. I'm a National Park Service Special Agent. My parents were Park Service Rangers and criminal investigators. I grew up in Yosemite. As a kid, it's just a small town that just happened to be surrounded by a national park, and everyone was kind of linked in some way to the park. The Tucker family conversations would not be your typical conversations at most of the households. My mom and dad would be trying to have a private conversation while making dinner or doing something, but we'd all hear it. It'd be my dad and my mom talking about work. I remember my older sister like, "Mom, just get caught, man. Like, you can't pull a fast one on her."
I've known Colin since he was 3 years old. I worked with his father and his mother in Yosemite. I think over the years, the Park Service has had an issue admitting that there is serious enough crime occurring in national parks where you need a criminal investigator to work on it. They don't want to admit that they're needed. They don't want to pay for them. And so I think those were some of the big issues that caused that early group of investigators to get shoved aside. But when you get 20 to 50,000 visitors a day, they're going to bring their problems with them. There's just no way to avoid it.
Yosemite National Park was one of the first Park Service units that hired full-time criminal investigators to serve that detective function. And then other parks throughout the service saw the success of that and followed suit. In 2003, the National Park Service decided to take all the special agents across the country at these individual parks and make one national unit out of them. And that's what we know today as the Investigative Services Branch.
And I really had no idea at 21 that I would wind up as a special agent. My dad was very excited, very, very happy to help me become a Park Service law enforcement officer. My mom was very like, do what you want. She was always like, please have a job. His son.
He went to the military, came back, and became a ranger, and he showed an interest in investigations, and one of my goals was to hire him before I retired, because I just felt he had what it takes. And that came from watching him as a ranger and the way he did investigations. He put his heart and soul into them.
So in the Yosemite ISB office, above the door to the file room, we had all of our cold case missing persons flyers and some of the flyers, the bulletins for our unsolved homicides. They would just kind of live taped to the wall above the door. And we did that as a reminder to be like, this is why we're here. I remember looking in the back file room on the shelves, and there's the Summit Meadow case file. And I knew just growing up that this was that case where my mom flew to Texas with Dawn and talked to a serial killer.
It was a national forest up in there.
Yosemite?
Yeah, Yosemite. I had one that I dropped off someplace. She was just stabbed to death and thrown out of the car.
I'd known about that, and but I didn't know the details. I just knew that my mom did that. And I was like, well, what's up with this one, Jeff?
I decided that this would be a good case to assign Cullen. The fact that his mother worked on it 40 years earlier, he's one of the original case agents on the case. I thought it was just a good match. And if nothing else, he could learn all the things about the case and, that maybe hadn't come up at the dinner table.
They called me up and they said, hey, Mom, I think I'm going to be working on the Summit Meadow case. And I probably said something like, well, that's good. And I'm glad. I'm glad somebody is.
Cullen started really going over the case file with a fine-tooth comb.
The Summit Meadow case was opened in June 28th, 1983. I wasn't even alive at that point. And so we have 3 or 4 binders and a couple file folders and a bunch of loose papers. And nothing's digitized. And so there's just binders that you have to go through. There really wasn't that much. But there's this almost 20-year period where besides the facial reconstruction and maybe following up on a few random leads, there's not a whole lot happening.
We always assumed the arm and the skull were together just based on the location they were found and their appearance. They both appeared to be out on the ground at the right amount of time to have been deposited at the same time.
In 2009, that's when they officially proved through DNA that the skull and the arm are the same person. They searched CODIS, the DNA database, to see if it's related to any offenders or known missing people or family, and there's nothing. And so the case is eventually suspended in 2012, and there's nothing.
I'll be honest with you, when I first assigned it to him, I didn't expect much to happen. I just wanted him to get familiar with it, just because I'd seen so many other people take a run at it, and there's just nowhere to go. There's no more evidence.
The Summit Meadow homicide investigation has lasted nearly 40 years, and there's 2 generations of investigators now have worked on it. This unidentified skeleton has a name. We need to find it. We need to help bring justice to these people and these families. So my first goal in taking this case over was to identify who she was. The DNA profile does not match to any known family members in CODIS or any known offender profiles in CODIS. The whole time I knew nothing had worked yet. Let's blank canvas, let's start over.
One of the things that I wanted Cullen to do was to research and find a way for us to have a more hyper-accurate facial reconstruction.
The first facial reconstruction is the clay one. It's black and white. Well, the person who created it was working with a very limited set of facts and a very limited skeleton.
Cullen took that on. He talked with the National Center for Exploiting Missing Children, NCMEC, and learned about some technology. So the skull was taken in, they did a CT scan, then those results were sent to NCMEC, and they created this very hyper accurate photo recreation drawing.
Then nothing really happens. And then all of a sudden, I'm catching cases. So I'm starting to work on these missing people cases in Yosemite. So I had some success linking skeletal remains to missing people. Some of the DNA stuff with the missing people is like starting to come back, and it like worked. I was like, this is cool. This is how I'm going to do this stuff. And then they started talking about the Golden State Killer. And they've been on the news in California that they just caught the guy.
Police say they now have the Golden State Killer in custody.
The killer accused of murdering at least 12 people, sexually assaulting more than 50. 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, former police officer, family man who was hiding in plain sight in suburban Sacramento.
They had linked his DNA to multiple crime scenes, but they didn't know who he was. And that's when they started reaching out to these ancestry databases for private genealogy, and eventually they identified Joseph D'Angelo.
They used DNA testing to find him. So many families are relieved this morning.
But the big take home is that this company called Parabon is doing this stuff. This is going to be the way of the future.
When detectives have DNA from a case and they want to help identify that person, they come to us. The cases that we work on, they are decades old. And all they know is whether the person is male or female. That's all the traditional forensic DNA can tell them. If you have a skull, they can use this pretty cool digital clay to mold and figure out what this person might have looked like. But it's still very broad. They don't know the person's eye color, their hair color, so the reconstructions generally have to be black and white because they don't have that information. What's so exciting is the DNA can now tell them that person's eye color, their hair color, the shape of their face, their ancestry, and help them winnow down who that person could have been.
I call Parabon, and they tell the story. And they're like, well, yeah, that actually might be something we want to do. And so that's like summer of 2020. I've kind of like just thought to myself, like, you know, we took it as far as we can. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
When the Summit Meadow Jane Doe samples came to us, they had DNA, they knew this was from a female, they knew her age, and that was about it. The question was, who was this person? We do a technique called whole genome sequencing, where basically it takes all of the DNA that was extracted from that sample and sequences it. We end up with millions and millions of pieces of data, and then we need to build that back into a profile of that person. That's where a forensic artist comes in.
They start off with a gray 3D head. My job as a forensic artist is just to turn it into something that looks like a normal, real human being.
Over many years, they thought the person was Hispanic. We were able to analyze that DNA and say, well, this is a person of European descent who's going to be very fair with blue eyes and blonde hair.
And I was like, oh my gosh. Right? Like, holy crap. It was like Parabon like took a laser beam and was like, ba-doom, that's who it is. I was like, get to the good part. Who is she related to? Because once we know who this person is, like, the other half of the case is now wide open. In this investigation, the biggest piece of what happened has always been, who is this person?
We have two sides of what we do. The first is the phenotyping, the prediction of that person's appearance. The other is genetic genealogy. And that's where CC comes in.
I'm Cece Moore. I'm an investigative genetic genealogist. Genealogy has traditionally been done through records, and so we would use census records, vital records, birth, marriage, death records. Genetic genealogy is using someone's DNA to learn more about their family tree and their genetic heritage. Investigative genetic genealogy is when we're using it for law enforcement purposes, either to identify a violent criminal or to identify somebody who has died without an identity. We're reverse engineering somebody's identity from their DNA. In the Golden State Killer case, that's what they did. They found common ancestors between people who shared DNA with that unknown Golden State Killer. They built forward from those people, and they eventually narrowed it down to just one person, which was Joseph DeAngelo.
When investigators used genetic genealogy to crack the Golden State Killer case, it was a watershed moment for how law enforcement solves crimes.
So the National Park Service came to Parabon and asked if we could use genetic genealogy to try to identify Summit Meadow Jane Doe. We'd upload to the GEDmatch database.
Law enforcement doesn't access information from consumer companies that collect DNA, but they do use GEDmatch.
GEDmatch is not a DNA testing company. They are a raw data repository.
And people can volunteer to add their DNA information to GEDmatch.
And then GEDmatch runs a comparison against all of the hundreds of thousands of people who are opted into law enforcement matching. Basically gives us a list. Here are the people who share DNA with your unknown person.
And so if we can find a number of matches who share DNA with each other, we build their family trees and we look for a common ancestral couple or a common ancestor. I call that a genetic network. So I had these three sets of common ancestors that I knew had to be in Jane Doe's family tree. Now I have to find someone who is descended from all of them. So because most of the matches in this case were so distant, I had to build those trees back to the early 1700s and even the 1600s in some cases. It took me a long time, but I finally found the triangulation marriage, the convergence of all of those genetic networks. I found a marriage of someone who descended from genetic network number 1 to somebody who descended from genetic networks 2 and 3. We know it's a female, so it's got to be a daughter or granddaughter of this couple. So once I was finally able to zero in on that one couple, that one immediate family, it became obvious to me that one of their daughters had not generated any records since 1983. And when I found her photo in her high school yearbook, I was shocked how much it looked like the snapshot phenotype. So I felt very confident that this must be Summit Meadow Jane Doe.
January 4th, 2021 was my first day back to work after holiday leave. And I opened up my email, and there's the second Parabon report. And we had calling him, and it was Tom Shaw and CC Moore. And I was like, oh my gosh, we got a name. It was Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom.
Colin called me, and I'm not ashamed to admit we were both in tears because it had been a long, long road. That we were finally going to give this family some answers.
I remember calling my mom, and I was like, hey mom, I got to tell you, we got a tentative ID on Summit Meadow. Her name is Patricia Dahlstrom. And I remember she started crying and just bawling. She's like, you got to call Don. You got to call Don.
We've been waiting almost 40 years to actually find out who our victim was. Who would have thought that back in '84, when Kim and I are finding the evidence, and the next day she's taken off the case, that her son would come back in the same position that she was in and identify her. And all I could think of was like, wow, what if he solves it?
Oh my God. After all these years, I thought, well, okay. I mean, you're going to have to follow it where it leads.
Now we have a name. Now we have to kind of try to figure out how she died. How did this woman get to Yosemite and be murdered?
Secrets in the wild, brutal murders, beautiful yet treacherous places. These are the stories of the investigators who solve crimes in the wilderness.
It was incredible to finally have it confirmed who exactly she was.
Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom.
Patty was a young woman looking for a purpose in her life.
The hardest part about this whole thing is who killed her.
It seemed like she was involved in a cult.
People would talk about these sexual rituals that they had to perform.
I've prosecuted several people that are purely evil. He was one of them.
Is it possible another suspect killed her? Absolutely.
She took one carefree day and went down the wrong road.